An idea of some power in human history has been that of the reappearance of the heroes of an earlier day. King Arthur will return when needed from Lyonesse. In a cave in Thuringia sleep Frederick Hohenstaufen and his knights, awaiting the trumpet call that will summon them to rescue their harassed posterity. The discovery of 800 ancient papyrus rolls at Herculaneum in 1752 seemed to promise that the wisdom of the ancients would help the modern world in a similar way.
Excavations at Pompeii, Herculaneum, Paestum and Stavia began in the first half of the 18th century. At Herculaneum, it was necessary to drive tunnels through the rocky surface in order to reach the remains of the Roman city. Excavation brought to light the main buildings of the Forum and a large part of the town. Then, in 1752, the tunnels reached a large Roman country house, buried at a depth of 60 feet under a rock-like layer of lava and hardened mud. This house possessed a library containing several hundred ancient rolls of papyrus. Johann Joachim Winckelmann, who has been called the father of archaeology, was among the first to describe this find.
In fact, they could see nothing in these manuscripts but so many bits of burned wood or charcoal. Accordingly, several of them were broken to pieces and thrown among the rubbish, just as the diamonds found in Brazil were treated like common pebbles, because the value of them was not known. The order in which these seemingly useless bits of charcoal were piled one upon another was the only circumstance to attract the notice of the workmen and convince them that there was something more than mere charcoal. Soon after, the characters on them were discovered. But the difficulty was, when these rolls were brought on the surface, to unroll them. Burning without oxygen, they were turned into carbon.
It was an ingenious and indefatigable Roman priest, Father Antony Piaggio, who devised a machine to draw apart the edges of the manuscripts and slowly separate the layers which had been tightly stuck together. Within 4 or 5 years of the first discovery, he had unrolled one of the carbonized rolls of papyri. It turned out to be a discussion on ancient music by Philodemus, the philosopher of the Epicurean school. High hopes were raised by this success of Father Piaggio. The hopes at last faded because work on unrolling these manuscripts went so slowly.
In 1776, when this report was printed, papyrus as a writing material had been entirely forgotten, and the Latin word was then in common use for paper. The truth, however, is that in the long history of the written word, papyrus was the first material to be widely used. Other materials were stone, wooden tablets, wax tablets, the skins of animals, and of these, vellum is the most luxurious form. About the 8th or 9th century after Christ, paper, invented by the Chinese and long kept a closely guarded secret, reached the West and quickly became popular. Paper could be made anywhere. Papyrus was restricted to the places where papyrus reed grew.
Cyperus papyrus, a reed which used to grow extensively in the Nile Delta, was a plant of many uses. In antiquity, the Egyptians made from it ropes and a coarse cloth for clothing and sandals. The roots served for fuel. The Nile fishermen made boats from bundled reed, and Tor Heyerdahl has recently crossed the Atlantic in an enlarged version, but its major use was as a writing material. Here is a sample of papyrus reed grown in the Royal Botanic Garden at Kew, which Mr. Baker of the British Museum is making into the writing material following the technique of the ancients. The strips of pith are laid on a flat bed, edge to edge, and a second layer is placed over these at right angles. Now they are hammered gently till the sticky sap, which chemically resembles gum arabic, binds the layers together. The making of papyrus was an Egyptian royal monopoly, and all the papyrus used in the ancient world for writing was imported from Egypt. The surface is burnished smooth with a stone. You can see its flexibility. This piece, shown against the light, reveals the two layers of the fibers clearly.
Papyrus was used in Egypt for more than 3,000 years before the birth of Christ. The dry sands of Egypt have preserved on papyrus books and documents and even quite ephemeral scribblings, which elsewhere have perished in the course of time.
For nearly 1,000 years after the death of Alexander the Great, Egypt was part of the great world of Greece and Rome. And while it was a part, it shared in the life of that world, in its literature. It had Greek settlers who lived in Egyptian towns, magnificent cities like Alexandria and Antinopolis, or else owned villas in the countryside. Throughout the Roman world, a whole series of Roman wall decorations and mosaics had as their theme Egypt, the land of mystery, with its monuments, its sagas of old, its secrets, its curious animals, the crocodile, the hippopotamus. This fascination returned in the period of Romanticism. In Mozart's Magic Flute, we can still feel how Europeans in the late 18th century hoped to find in the wisdom and ritual of Egypt a new and satisfying answer to the mystery of life itself. Perhaps the answer could be found on the walls of temples and tombs, in the strange and beautiful illustrations to the Egyptian texts, themselves written in picture writing, the hieroglyphs. But the hieroglyphs could not yet be read. The Greek texts could.
Papyri containing works of Greek and Latin literature, which scholars would have prized wherever found, were preserved better in reignless Egypt than anywhere else. This roll of Homer, discovered early in the 19th century, was a promise of greater things to come.
Napoleon's journey to Egypt was actually the beginning of the scientific study of Egyptology, since he took with his army also a team of scholars geologists, surveyors, and other scientists who made a minute record of the monuments they found. Their finds were published in a series of impressive volumes covering the art, architecture, and social history of ancient Egypt. Eventually, Napoleon, after the Battle of the Pyramids, was forced to evacuate Egypt, but his team of scholars remained behind. It was these men who discovered the Rosetta Stone in 1802. But because Napoleon lost the war, the stone came to London, not Paris, and after 30 years or so, study of this stone by the Englishman Young and the Frenchman Champollion provided the key to the hieroglyphs and intensified the hope that Egypt might help to illuminate the mysteries of the present through the solution of the riddles of the past.
As the cultivated area in Egypt expanded, the demand for fertile earth grew enormously. Farmers removed it by donkey load and camel load, by cart, and at last by railway. As ancient sites were stripped, papyri began to appear in masses, just as they'd been thrown away in the ancient world, on outdoor rubbish heaps. And so many thousands, perhaps millions of texts must have been thrown away and destroyed.
Among the first to realize their value was Joseph Karabachek, professor in Vienna and later librarian of the Imperial Library there. He worked in close cooperation with his fellow countryman Telegraph. Eventually, thousands of texts, papyrus rolls, single sheets and books were transferred to Vienna, principally for the collection of the Archduke Rainer.
As the word went round that Europeans were ready to buy written sheets, more and more were offered to the dealers by their finders.
The local inhabitants of the Nile Valley sometimes even forged or manufactured ancient-style papyri, though such fabrications were normally easy to detect.
It was in the 1880s when what had been a considerable flow of papyrus into Europe turns into a flood. There was the roll of the Constitution of Athens, a work that had been lost to scholars and aroused enormous interest. There were the poems of an observer of everyday life, Herondas, writing probably in the middle of the 3rd century BC, a writer whose work was known only in quotations, or the princely poet Bacchylides, who wrote on commission for royal and other important patrons in the 5th century. A long and beautifully written roll of his poetry came to the British Museum in 1896. In London, these rolls were put in front of the young Frederick Kenyon, who produced editions of these lost works in what scholars have since thought was an amazingly short time.
The arrival of texts such as these challenged a new generation of scholars. The great Mommsen, who was first to recognize the importance for historical study of collecting from a mass of documents the details that in themselves are trivial, but when assembled and related become significant. It was he who directed into work on papyri in Germany a young German student, Ulrich Wilken, who was later to become a father figure of papyrological studies. In Vienna, Karl Wessely taught himself to read the most difficult handwriting and began a calcanteric output of publication. His pioneering works have never received the credit they merited. In France, there was Jouguet, in Italy, Vitelli, and many others.
Actual finds of papyri remained haphazard and unorganized for almost the whole of the 19th century. Two Oxford scholars, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, conceived the idea in 1895 of actually mounting an expedition, backed by the Egypt Exploration Fund, to explore systematically ancient sites in which papyri might be found. About 250 miles inland, on the edge of the desert, more or less untouched by modern developments, was the town of Beit Neza, Oxyrhynchus, as it was known to the Greeks and Romans.
Oxyrhynchus means the city of the sharp-nosed fish, a type of large pike found in the Nile and worshipped by the local Egyptians.
The reason why they picked this spot may be given in Grenfell's own words.
Being the capital of the district, it must have been the abode of many rich persons who could afford to possess a library of literary texts, and it was likely there would be early Christian literature because of the number of churches. The unplundered ruins of the old town were known to be fairly extensive, and it was probable that most of them were of the Greco-Roman period.
Most important, Oxyrhynchus was also situated in the area above the water table of the Nile. Often papyri buried in the sand tended to be destroyed by the damp rising from below during the annual floods. In the winter of 1896-7, Grenfell and Hunt started digging on the old town site, an area roughly 1¼ miles long by ½ a mile broad. They spent several weeks with little tangible result. Then, on the 11th of January 1897, a low mound was dug. Almost immediately there turned up a sheet of papyrus recognized as containing sayings of Jesus, which we now know was part of the Gospel of Thomas. A second sheet was a portion of St. Matthew's Gospel. The flow of papyri soon became a torrent it was difficult to keep up with.
From these trenches have come copies of the poems of Sappho, the Searching Satyrs by Sophocles, the play Hypsipyle by Euripides, Callimachus, Menander.
110 men were employed digging, and it was hard to find enough baskets in old Beineza to contain the papyri, and sometimes also to raise enough money to pay the workmen. Packing case after packing case, made of tin by the local blacksmith, were stuffed with rolls, single leaves, and fragments. In all, something like 900 boxes were brought back to England during the whole period of excavation, which continued until 1907. It was during the winters that Grenfell and Hunt excavated in Egypt. In the summers, they were back in their headquarters at Oxford, editing as much of the material as they had time for. The first volume of Oxyrhynchus Papyri came out in 1898. The series now runs to nearly 40 volumes and is far from being complete.
In the last 70 years, more new manuscripts of works of Greek and Latin literature have been recovered than in any comparable period since the Renaissance. A new and immediate contact has been reopened with the ancient world. Papyri are still being discovered faster than scholars can transcribe and edit them. In libraries, universities, and museums of almost every European country, we shall find papyri are being studied. Helsinki, Oslo, Paris, Strasbourg, Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Geneva. It is impossible to name them all, but we must not forget Cairo in Egypt, Princeton, and the University of Michigan. In England, Oxford and London are very active centres. University College London has had a long association with papyrological work. Under the shadow of its dome, work on the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, work which began in 1897, continues.
The contents of this box have lain unexamined since it was filled on the site at Oxyrhynchus 70 years ago. In the box are not only papyri, but sometimes pieces of straw, parchment, Grenfell's cigarette papers, and even an ancient reed pen. It can still write. as it did 2,000 years ago.
Hey mice, hey moan, hey mouse, hey mine. Hey meteros, hey meru, hey meteru, hey metero, hey metero. Hey meteros, hey meteru, hey metero, hey metero. Hey aute, hey eme, hey say, hey metera, hey humera, hey polis, hey politeia.
The dry and brittle papyrus, when placed between layers of damp blotting paper, absorbs water and becomes flexible again. The thymol crystals in the glass inhibit the growth of mildew. Relaxing of the damp papyrus is a simple, painstaking job. Other forms of papyrus require different treatment. Sometimes papyri already inscribed have been reused in a papier-mâché called cartonnage to make mummy cases and wrap corpses, even those of crocodiles. This film, made in 1962 by the late Professor Bataille and his colleagues at the Sorbonne, is a record of the dismounting of the mask of a mummy from the early 3rd century BC, which contained fragments of literature. A solution of hydrochloric acid and hot water was used to dissolve the surface plaster on the mask. After treatment, the paste binding the sheets of papyrus was softened by steaming on a metal grid over a brass boiler. When the papyrus had been ironed smooth, it was read on a ground glass screen lit above and below. It proved to contain substantial fragments of a comedy, The Man from Sicyon, by Menander. The fragments now go between sheets of dry blotting paper. Glass is placed on top to flatten them as they dry. Industrial methylated spirit dissolves the dirt without harming the ink. It is basically dry cleaning. A record is kept which ties with the infantry numbers of the boxes at the excavation. Every piece from these boxes is also microfilmed for the record and provides a quick reference to the contents.
Come in.
Selected pieces of papyri are taken away to be photographed individually. Standard industrial cameras are used. Procedure is basically simple. The main purpose is to increase the contrast between the papyrus and the writing. This is done by using a panchromatic film with a red filter. In a few difficult cases, films sensitive to infrared are used. On the right is a piece of original papyrus. This is almost unreadable. The left picture is photographed in the ordinary way, and the center is infrared. The colors seen on the screen are slightly distorted. Prolonged development of the film has the effect of further increasing the contrast.
Many papyri are like this one, fragmentary, full of holes, surface rubbed away, ink faded. Here we can read the report on the reception given by the people of Alexandria to the visiting Roman Crown Prince Germanicus in the year AD 18. "Bravo!" shouted the crowd, and Germanicus, like Abraham Lincoln, was moved at the ovation that gave him a place in the hearts of the people.
When reading, first we have to decide, is it a literary or documentary hand? If the former, is it verse or prose? If verse, the meter helps us to recognize it. When it is in prose, the smaller the piece, the harder it is to place. We have here one of 35 pieces, large and small, in the same handwriting. Some of the large ones have been identified as in the Ionic dialect and from the second book of Herodotus. They are written in capitals, without word division or punctuation. In many, the words are not complete, but we have determined the average number of letters per line. With the microscope, we check the letters which are not clear. We also look for the fiber patterns seen in other pieces. It is like a jigsaw puzzle in 3 dimensions. In an unknown work, or document, our problems are more far-reaching.
We conjure you, great demon, Alpha and Omega, great star in the sky, bring my girl Thaïsis to my bed. Ablanath Alba, Ablanath Alba.
Reading the papyrus requires us to interpret as well as transcribe. In the Herodotus, the problem is to place the small fragments in context. Here, this fragment has the word phonu, killing, bloodshed. From the index, we found how often and in which places it occurs in the text. In chapter 100, it comes 16 letters before the word histien, to banquet, a word present in the next line. All 35 pieces are now in place. Our fragment runs, Queen Nitocris invited to a banquet all the Egyptians whom she knew to be chiefly responsible for her brother's murder. This papyrus of a known author gives us a copy 8 centuries earlier than the medieval manuscripts on which our printed text relies. The private life and everyday administration of Greco-Roman Egypt are brought to life in every sort of way by the surviving documents.
Aurelius Hierocles and Aurelia Maria of Oxyrhynchus agree that we have dissolved our mutual union, and each of us has his belongings in full. There are no children of our union, and each of us has the power to marry whom he or she may choose. 26th of January, AD 304. Sun arose to Caius, his dearest friend, warmest greeting. If you are in health, it is well. Theon brought in to me, O Harpim, royal banker of Oxyrhynchus, who spoke of the dishonesty of Epaphras. Don't let yourself be ruined through them. Believe me, excessive goodness of heart, more than anything else, brings men to ruin.
Discoveries of the works of the greatest Greek authors are hardly daily occurrences, and excite our immediate attention. Among these pieces is one fragment in a handwriting very similar to a known papyrus of a tragedy by Euripides.
The play is the Hippolytus, one of the 76 tragedies and satyr plays we know him to have written, although only 19 of these, including the Hippolytus, survive to be passed on in medieval manuscripts. It was his second play on the theme of Hippolytus and Phaedra, and was first performed in Athens in 428 BC.
Yes, I think this must be from the same copy of the play as this bit that was found before, this big piece. The handwriting looks exactly the same, and a particularly distinctive letter is this tau. You see here, the right-hand side of the prostrate.
Oh,
it looks longer than the left-hand side.
It's extremely like a gamma, actually.
Yes, as you see, it's like something like that.
Oh, yes. This, of course, is that famous passage, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. It's where Phaedra is philosophizing, having admitted her love.
Oh, yes. And we recognize what is good, but we don't do it.
Well, that's the usual reading, yes. That's reading ta Kresta. But the papyrus has the reading ha Kresta, which gives a rather different meaning. What we recognize as good, we fail to carry out.
Oh, yes. Well, that actually is a known reading, if I remember rightly. Well, if you're lucky, I think you're going to get a great deal of this manuscript. If I remember rightly, there was a piece of it published by Mr. Roberts more than 20 years ago.
Yes, 2224.
That was Oxyrhynchus 2224. I just get it.
It's in volume 19, I think, Professor, unless it's 20.
What sort of date would you say?
2nd century, probably early, I think. I wouldn't put it earlier than that because of the alpha, among other things.
Yeah.
Yes, this is the text that I had in mind, and it did, as a matter of fact, have a number of unique and interesting words, readings in it, which are different from the manuscript one. As a matter of fact, we've got it in here. It's been brought down from Oxford so that we can put this whole manuscript together.
Oh, yes. Well, I hope we get some more of this papyrus, because it's turning up some interesting stuff. This more extensive piece here has some interesting readings in this place, about 250, I think it is. All the manuscripts of the play present the word stergethra, phenon, the mind's affection, whereas the papyrus has Thelgetra, the mind's bewitchment.
Yes, that is interesting, because when Plutarch quotes this passage, quotes Thelgetra instead of Stergetra, and people have always, editors of the play have always felt in the past that Plutarch was merely quoting carelessly. But now the papyrus shows us that this in fact was a genuine reading which circulated in antiquity. It may perhaps not be the right reading, but at least we can absolve Plutarch from the charge of carelessness.
One point which emerges from the manuscripts is relatively how few errors there are in manuscripts that have been copied and recopied. More exciting again is the recovery of works lost completely. Menander, who lived 2 centuries after Euripides, didn't have Euripides' luck. No medieval manuscript of Menander's many comedies had survived, but papyri have given these plays back to us, starting with the papyrus text found in 1906.
When we try to recreate these texts as works of the theatre, we're helped by the parallel discoveries of works of art with representations deriving from ancient performances. A very interesting set of scenes from Menander was discovered in 1962 in a house on the island of Lesbos, whose owner, some 6 centuries after the dramatist's lifetime, was evidently keen enough on these theatrical classics to have them as decoration.
What are the plays that are represented on these mosaics?
This one, for example, is the Epitrepontes. It shows the arbitration scene which is mentioned in the title, The Arbitrants. Here we have the play called The Dagger, Enchiridion. This one is the apparition, the phasma.
For us, one of the important questions is to ask how far the artist is really representing what happened on the stage. In this scene from Act 5 of the Misouinos, The Man She Hated, our text seems to require the presence of 4 characters, and it looks as if the mosaic maker has eliminated one of them.
That's a very interesting suggestion about the Misouinos. Is it true about the phasma too?
Well, of course, that really is very difficult to answer, because in this mosaic, where the girl is coming out from the hole in the wall wearing her beautiful gold dress, and her lover has suddenly been surprised by her father, involves us in a scene indoors. And the scene indoors on a Greek theatre is difficult to show. Still more so if you've got to have 2 rooms, one from which house from which she can pass to the other. And then I think also in this new portion of the play that's in this text, that scene or something like it is reported to us by the servant of the man next door, who really is fond of this girl himself and who is absolutely made jealous by the report that her face is being kissed away in there.
Well, do we have actual representations from the plays in these mosaics?
Well, I think the Samia illustration would help us if we could find it. The scene here is labelled, as commonly, Act 3 of the Samia, and on the right we have a character labelled Cook, and he, according to the text, has just said, I'm going to stand aside a little, and that's what he's doing. And then in the centre of the old man, throwing his mistress out of the house and saying with a very angry gesture, get out, do you hear me? And there she is, further over, actually getting out. So that is rather close, I think.
And that's particularly interesting because in the new papyrus manuscript found in Geneva, it's clear the cook is present. People tried to keep him out of this scene and make it an intimate scene between man and mistress, but it's much more suitable for the comic stage, much less serious than it would be if the cook is there and trying to put his oar in.
Yes.
My other problem are these fragments, these ends of lines, which I think may be from the same year. The same character, Moskian, occurs here, and it's part of a dialogue, obviously.
Oh, of course, of this play, we still haven't got the whole, have we? We've got third act, fourth act, fifth act, quite a lot of the second, less of the first, and parts of the prologue and the first act have quite considerable holes, so it maybe will go in there. And you've even got a Moscow in this piece in a slightly different context again. You might indeed have a play and a half, and of course one's always getting new problems when you have new finds.
So, what is the next find going to be? Perhaps another fragment of Samia, or a laundry bill.